talk today is on quality intelligence and how you can use that to create differentiation for your organization and use it to your strategic advantage. And this is actually a tactical playbook that you can take and use to implement a learning culture in your own organization. So today we're going to go through a number of different topics. I'm going to start with aligning everyone on the purpose of testing, and we're going to talk about what a learning culture is, because that's what we ultimately want to develop. We're going to define quality intelligence and look at some structure around that and go into a deep dive on the pillars of QI. And then we're going to transition and talk about what does the future of QI look like with AI. I was just at an IBM conference last week, and I learned some really fascinating things I want to bring back. And then we'll wrap up with just a few takeaways that you guys can take and put in your back pocket to implement QI in your own organization. So by the time we're done here today, and hopefully if you read my paper, which is fascinating, you'll be able to understand how to integrate the voice of the customer into your ways of working, and how to use the information in that voice of the customer into making proactive, informed decisions. I'm going to challenge you to reimagine agile testing as a strategic learning opportunity. And finally, we'll understand how we can bridge quality with products, compliance, legal, all sorts of functional silos in your organization. So I'd like to introduce you to Team Helix. Team Helix is a cross-functional agile team who works on a healthcare organization's online patient portal. And they recently redesigned the prescription refill process. All of the tests passed, automation coverage was strong, UAT gave 2 thumbs up, and release sign-off happened without delay. But within 48 hours, call volume spiked. Elderly users were confused with the new workflows, and caregivers were experiencing frustration, and they couldn't complete simple tasks for the patients that they cared for. Team Helix was confused. This was a no-brainer for the business, and they thought they knocked it out of the park. So it led Team Helix to start asking questions. What went wrong? How well do we know our customers? And are we really even listening to them? And that brings us to understand what is the purpose of testing? Because too often, quality is reduced to just test case pass-fail rates and doesn't really reflect the true lived experience of our customers and our users, those that are both internal and external to our organization. And the signals that matter the most often slip through the cracks unnoticed. And without these, teams aren't really able to build products and solutions that meet their customer needs because they lack the right understanding and knowledge. So traditional quality metrics, they don't challenge our assumptions or build our knowledge outside of what is required in the requirements and the specifications. Organizational learning theory, particularly double loop learning, which we're going to talk about in the next few slides, they require us to challenge our assumptions so that we put in place effective feedback systems to help us correct actions and answer more than did we just build it right. It helps us to understand if we solve the right problem. And Margaret Wheatley, who's an organizational theorist, she's been quoted as saying, for organizations to achieve long-term sustainability, they must transform into a learning culture. Organizations, they want to be around forever. And we think that by passing our test cases, that's going to ensure we're building the right things. But when we challenge ourselves to ask, are we truly a learning culture? Well, that's when we start to wonder, what can we do differently? And a learning culture, I'm going to define that here for you guys. A learning culture is supported by 2 pillars. The first pillar is organizational knowledge. So a learning culture says that, hey, we have to always challenge our mental models, what we know, what we think that we know is true, challenge our biases, and engage in curiosity-led learning so that we grow our knowledge. The second pillar is organizational intelligence. So first we start by growing our knowledge, And then we use that new knowledge to inform our intelligence, right? So we're not using assumptions. We're not using I think anymore. I know with fact because of data. And together, when you start to grow your knowledge and you use that to inform your intelligence, now you've enabled decision making that's rooted in data based on new information that we've learned. And we use that to create a shared understanding in our organization. And a learning culture is essentially double loop learning. When we think about, I mentioned earlier, test case pass fail rates, they don't really tell us that lived experience of our users. That's what's called a single loop learning. Double loop learning, double loop learning forces us to grow that knowledge, make those informed, intelligent next step decisions, and then wonder what were the outcomes and learn from that, explore what that impact was. So now that we understand truly what a learning culture is, we have an enhanced definition of the purpose of testing. Now let's look at defining what quality intelligence is. And quality intelligence is the operating discipline that turns real world experience into decisions and outcomes. It's not a new term, right? The theme of this conference is quality intelligence. But I aim in my paper and in this talk to define it, to put some structure around it, and to give you those tactical steps to implement it in your organization. It's the strategic use of feedback from our users, our customers. It's strategic feedback from our system behavior and operational insights. And we use these to inform our decisions, enhance our outcomes, and to build trust with our users and customers. It extends our traditional quality practices by embedding learnings and insights into every step of the delivery lifecycle. It says here on the slide, QI, say that fast and you get it mixed up with QA. QI is both a practice and a mindset. It doesn't just improve delivery, it brings quality closer to where product decisions and strategy are made, where business outcomes are shaped. And essentially, it reframes quality as a driver of customer outcomes and product success, not just defect detection. And it challenged us to ask 3 questions in a continuous manner. What are we hearing right now? So it challenges us to listen to those signals, listen for the feedback that we don't always see with those test case pass-fail rates. It challenges us to ask, what do we collectively think it means? It forces us to align on that experience, the things that we're hearing. And it also challenges us to act and ask, what are we going to do differently next? And how do we know that it worked? So as we look at how we put structure in place around quality intelligence, similar to a learning culture, we have some pillars to support the outcomes we want to achieve. And so we have customer-centered signals, which force us to listen. We create that shared understanding and we generate alignment. And then that third pillar is operational insights, where we take action. So first, I'm going to talk about customer-centered signals. Customer-centered signals help us understand who is struggling. It helps us understand at what moment in their customer journey did they experience the challenge. It helps us wonder, how severe is the impact? And then finally, we learn what's the cost of waiting if we don't take action now. So I mentioned traditional quality signals quite a few times, and these may look familiar to you guys, and these are just an example of what you may experience today as a quality professional. We have metrics that tell us about test case pass-fail rates and defect counts and trends. We have metrics that measure how much of our product is covered with automation. We have quality gates that force us to say, yes, everything passed, we're good to go. And then we have release sign-offs and things like that. But all of these traditional quality signals, together, they tell us, did we build it right? Whereas if we use customer-centered signals to help us develop an understanding, this is where we pull in things like research, right? We bring in surveys and usability studies. We take a look at journey metrics, right? Where are we on the customer journey when they experience an error? And how is that different than what I thought it would be? It challenges us to go into observability, going into stores. If we work on software for registrations, say at PetSmart, go into a PetSmart store and observe that cashier using our software. What does that look like in real time? So customer-centered signals answer the question, did we solve the right problem? These challenge our assumptions, our biases, and our opinions about what we think we did. And it forces us to really explore, did we really do that? So I'm not going to do a deep dive into all of these signals, these strategic signals in QI, but there are 6-ish strategic signals that I've defined in my paper. There are many more. There are many different definitions that you can find online. But for the purposes of QI, we have direct customer feedback, and that's been around forever, right? That's where we get feedback. We interview people, they do surveys, and we get that direct feedback from our customer. We have indirect customer feedback, the things that we can observe, right, in our application logs, through replays, things like that. And we have support and escalation loops, right? Things that we're hearing through our operations and support teams. We can engage in hypothesis-driven experimentation, and we can validate our assumptions as part of that feedback loop. We can engage in technical observations, and then finally team learning loops, which is embedded at the team level. And what I've shared here are just AI opportunities. I'm not doing a deep dive into AI in this talk. I am not an AI professional, but these are just some opportunities that you can explore on how you can use this information to drive your understanding. So we talked about, now that we have a deeper understanding of the purpose of testing, which is where we have to start asking, did we go from asking if we built it right to did we build the right thing? And together with those customer-centered signals, now we've actually impacted our knowledge. So if you go, that's a really big arrow. But if we go back to that learning culture, right, how I define the pillars and the outcomes, now we're tactically addressing that first pillar of growing our organizational knowledge. And we just talked about that first pillar, customer-centered signals, and how we listen. And now I'm going to talk about that second pillar, which is creating a shared understanding and aligning with your organization on what you're observing. Because when we share new information learned, when we don't hold that to ourselves, not only do we challenge or confirm our assumption, the entire organization does. It informs our existing mental models. We all have mental models that we walk around with, right? We all know that to open a door, we turn a doorknob to the right and then we push it open. It forces us to develop curiosity-led learning. So that's interesting. I didn't expect that. I wonder what will happen if. And then finally, when we create that shared understanding, it improves collectively our data dictionary and the language that we use in our organization. So how do you create a shared understanding effectively? Well, we have 5 different characteristics of feedback, and I put together this lovely, easy to remember acronym, ACE it. You can ace it. You can ace it. I still haven't perfected the tagline here. So you can embed continuous feedback into how we work and ace it. That's terrible. I need to work on that. Thank you, Sophia. So I'll start with the first letter in that acronym. A stands for actionable. We want feedback to be actionable, and we want it to be meaningful as well. So here's a template, if you will, or a repeatable process that you can follow to help ensure that your feedback is actionable. Number one, create a clear problem statement written in plain language, right? Sometimes we get a little technical. Not everybody is technical. I bet if I had a conversation with somebody in sales, their technical language is going to be far different than the technical language I use or you guys use. We want to provide context. Who is affected? Which of our customers, right? You can't just say our customers. Clearly, if you remember Team Helix, it worked, that prescription refill process worked for all of their users except elderly users and caregivers, right? So we need to give context on who is affected and where and when in their journey. We need to understand the impact. You guys are all familiar with defect impacts, right? So we need to clearly articulate what's the severity of the impact and how does it impact our customers. That helps us to understand what is the cost of waiting. If we don't fix this now, here is the impact to our customers and or business. We also want to provide traceability to the evidence. How do we know this? What was our signal that made us curious and say, this is a feedback loop we have to create? And finally, we have to put in place some recognition signals. How do we know if we do address this? How do we know that we've made the intended improvement in our system? So not the fix itself, not the solution, but what are we going to look at to see if we're moving the needle in the right way? So here's an example of how some feedback could be written in an actionable way. So seniors are dropping at the insurance steps as there are too many clicks, preventing refill requests from being completed. The impact of that is that senior customers will not receive important medication when they need it, possibly impacting their health. Now that's a story, right? You can understand that, you can visualize it, and you can kind of go along that journey with your senior users as they're experiencing that confusion. This traceable evidence can be observed through clickstream and abandonment spikes in our telemetry. And we'll know that the problem has been addressed when the abandonment rate at the insurance step by our senior customers trends downward by 15%. So that's pretty easy to follow. I mean, I wrote it, so I think it's pretty easy to follow. A little bias there. But that is an example of how you can make feedback actionable, not just for your team, but for your whole organization, and create a shared understanding on what the problem is, who's experiencing it, what the impact is, what the cost of waiting might be, where the traceable evidence is, and how you're going to know that you've made an impact. And as we go along our ACIT acronym, now we are on C, which stands for cross-functional. And I totally lost my brain right there, so I'm just going to go here to my slide. Okay. When we think about creating a shared understanding, we want to do that throughout our organization, not just within our team. And to do that, when we write our feedback in an actionable way, and we describe the problem in that repeatable format, we're doing a couple of things. We're enabling a shared taxonomy, a shared language across our organization. We're empowering all of the different disjointed functional roles to come together and participate in joint triaging or solutioning of the challenge. And by referencing where the evidence lies, we're linking our artifacts together to create true end-to-end traceability from where we observe the challenge and to where it's being experienced once there's something released to production to address it. So we're creating traceability, that shared language, and we're engaging all parts of the organization to help be a part of the solution. When we think about that E in ACIT, it challenges us to be empathetic. Sophia had a great talk on empathy earlier, right? We want to be able to understand what our customers are seeing, experiencing, feeling, what their journey is. Because when we have empathy for our customers, all of our customers, we can be curious when we see a requirement come through that says redesign the prescription refill experience. Well, what about our elderly users? We heard someone talk about bringing in blind testers, right, to actually test. Heather, talk about bringing in blind testers. Well, if you're talking about redesigning the workflow and the UI to where there's a little tiny button, and I understand that our elderly users have sight issues, that might not be a great option, design UX person, right? How can we really bring their lived experience to what it is that we're producing as a solution? We also want to integrate. So that means we want to embed these feedback loops as part of new ways of working. Far too often, I don't know if you guys have experienced this, but you'll have a defect come up, or you'll hear some challenges of customers that they're having in production, and a war room will be created, and everybody has to go to that and have a discussion about this big hot topic issue. It's very reactionary, right? When we embed QI and feedback as part of our ways of working, it becomes strategic. I can proactively identify challenges. We can solve for things maybe sometimes before even our customers realize there's problems. And it becomes a habit, right? We're always talking about our customers. We're always bringing them into the forefront of our mind. So these are the three things that you need to know in order to integrate these feedback loops, these customer-centered signals into your ways of working. You have to ask the question, where do these loops live in our tools and rituals? So we want them in our existing processes, our existing ways of working, our existing team ceremonies and events. We can include our customers in our feedback as we engage in our demos, right? We can talk about our customer. We can talk about the changes and how they're going to impact them, or the problems they're actually going to solve and address, or opportunities, right, that it even creates. We have to ask, when is it going to show up relative to our planning, to our release cycle, for operations? Because we want this feedback to always appear in the right decision window. Remember, this is shifting us from being reactionary to proactive and strategic. So it's important we're getting that feedback just in time when it matters. And then finally, who needs to know? So a lot of times we like to think that we're the experts, right? We found a defect and this is how we have to solve for it. But the reality is that we all fit in our own functional role in an organization. And when we consider who needs to know, that empowers all functional roles in the organization to take action in lockstep, because you have the same shared understanding of what the problem is and the impact. And then finally, when we think about that ACIT acronym, it needs to be timely. Timely feedback, as we just talked about, it supports that just-in-time refinement, right? If we get it in time for planning, it supports pivot or persevere decisioning. Do we continue down this path? Or is the feedback that we're seeing, the signals that we're receiving, telling us we have to stop and ignore those sunk costs and take a different direction? But if you'll notice, it says timely, not immediate. So, for example, I play the ukulele badly. And when I play for my friends and family, specifically my granddaughters, I don't want them to interrupt me and tell me, Grammy, you need to really practice, right? I want to finish and then give me some holistic feedback based on what you observed. So it's an important balance to find. And it's one that's going to change from situation to situation. But just remember, timely, not immediate, and try and use your best judgment there. So when we think about how we can tactically grow empathy and understanding, here's a few different practice areas. that you can engage in your organization. So number one, you can engage in persona-based detection. So personas, for those of you who don't know, they're fictional representations of your customers, and they can represent both internal and external customers. You can engage in insight-driven testing. So how are the insights that we're seeing and receiving from these signals influencing the outcomes and the behaviors of our users? We can practice outcome-focused scope. So are we really focusing on the right outcomes? And how are we defining what our MVP is as a part of exploring that? We can engage in risk forecasting. We heard a lot about risks yesterday in our end of day keynote with our end of day keynote speaker. And then finally, we can engage in using telemetry and exploring the messaging that we're receiving, that indirect signals, to see what's working, right? We can put in place some alerts and use that information to help us get to the root cause of challenges that we're seeing. So we started off with our first pillar, which was customer-centered signals. And we developed a deeper understanding of the purpose of testing and what customer-centered signals are. Now we just layered in a shared understanding, right? Creating continuous feedback loops in our organization. So we've effectively grown our knowledge, and we've used that new knowledge to help inform our organizational intelligence. So when we think about that learning loop, right? The pillars that are required on the practices and behaviors that are required to transform into a learning organization, we've now effectively influenced two of those with quality intelligence. And that takes us to our third pillar, which is operationalized insights. And this is where we have a call to action. Because QI is the connective tissue between teams, products, compliance, marketing, all areas of the organization. And it enables us to answer these and address these 4 points here. They challenge us to ask, what did we learn when we look at all those customer-centered signals? What are the emerging patterns and the correlation? How does that relate to what we thought it would do? Where are we accumulating risk, right? Where are those unseen things that are happening? And how can we exploit those sooner? And then finally, QI challenges us to continually ask ourselves, what do we need to learn faster? Not deliver faster, learn faster. And I mentioned that QI is the connective tissue. So what does that really mean? It means that we have evidence and feedback that is tied to decisions, right? So we create that linkage, that end-to-end traceability. We build it into our operating model. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that so that we can scale this knowledge and the intelligence across the organization. And then finally, we create a traceable thread so that anyone in the organization can follow that signal to the shared understanding, to our decisions and outcomes. So when we think about how quality intelligence supports existing operating model frameworks, you can see when we put in place these loops, this double loop learning, we can effectively, as quality professionals, influence roadmap prioritization. We can help with our backlog refinement, right? We're bringing that real-time user feedback back to our organization to inform those next steps. It helps us redefine our MVP because we're learning in real time what's valuable to our customers, what are they using, and does that really meet what our assumptions are? It helps influence portfolio investments, the investments that we're making, those pivot or persevere decisions. And finally, it leads us to a way to really measure value. And quality intelligence is that throughput line through all of those activities. And again, like with all of the other pillars, here are some activities and tactical ways that you can help influence all of those outcomes that we just talked about. And when we put together the purpose of testing and customer-centered signals, together with that shared understanding, we're able to operationalize our insights. And effectively what we've done when we put in place those 3 pillars of QI, those practices and behaviors, we've tactically implemented a learning culture and double loop learning cycles in our organization. So remember Team Helix, I introduced them at the start. They began to ingest all of this feedback openly, challenge their assumptions, their opinions, engage in collaboration across the organization, and helped to develop new ways of working. And one thing that I hope that you'll see is that this all started with Team Helix. It didn't start with a leader. It didn't start with operation leader, somebody that's seeing trends. It all starts with us. And we don't need permission to do this. You think about the keynote, the opening speaker from yesterday, April, we talked about change agents. We are all change agents, right? If you see a gap, step in and fill it. It takes nothing to reach out and say, what telemetry do we have? How can we understand, right? Talking about empathy. How do we understand what our customers are doing, feeling? We can bring that storytelling into our team events, right? We talk about our sprint planning or when we're refining our team backlog. We can talk about the specific people, our specific customers that these things are going to tactically impact. So sometimes we wait for permission. When it comes to quality intelligence, just take the charge. Bring it into your team. The more you can create opportunities for collaboration and alignment, the more you will move the needle for differentiated outcomes. And I mentioned at the start of the conversation that I went to another conference last week, and it was incredibly interesting. I attended this one talk, and I do need to look at the name of it because I cannot remember it. I attended a talk that was labeled AI-driven continuous product quality improvement using support insights. And it was research done by IBM together with a professor from York University in Canada. And they had done experiments around using different developer inputs to see if there's a correlation to defects that pop up in production. So a few things that I remember from the talk where they used metrics like the number of co-authors on the code, number of code check-ins, and a variety of other inputs. And what was fascinating is that they were able to predict, I think there was like a 78% correlation between those metrics and production defects, which popped up. And I got excited as I was listening to them talk because I wondered, right? I became curious and I wondered, they're looking left, right? On that, if you think about your continuous delivery pipeline, they're looking left early in that development. Now, what if we brought in those right-leaning metrics, right? From production, those customer-centered signals. I wonder what story that could tell us and how that could help us with our roadmap, with our backlog refinement, with our MVP definition. So exciting to wonder what that future can look like. And they actually asked to do a little bit of collaboration. So I'm super excited to see how that progresses. So as I wrap up my talk, I promised you some steps that can help you tactically implement quality intelligence in your organization. So number one, build partnerships. So if you don't know somebody in marketing, ask your manager, ask your leader. Hey, I really want to create some partnerships here. Can you help me do that? How can I do that? Redefine your MVP, redefine and reassess your MVP. Always be curious. Do we have the right assumptions here? Instrument for the user experience. So create some empathy and awareness around the different personas or customers that you have in your organization, both internal and external. Make feedback part of your definition of done. That's pretty powerful, right? It's great to say we did it, but is it done? I don't know if anybody's ever heard that term. It's done, yes, but is it done? Not till you have that feedback and shared understanding. And then finally, the last thing, measure and share your learnings. As quality professionals, we can easily do all of these things. You don't have to wait for permission. We are all change agents. And I hope this helps you get started on your journey.